Hey there, Blue Rockers. It's time once again for another episode of Stan's Bible Class. This is a Connie Willis production being brought to you from Blue Rock Talk on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and D Live. And we're here once again to take a deep dive into the Bible and see what we can learn on a particular topic. And today we're going to look at Pope Peter. We've got to find out just exactly where the concept of Pope Peter comes from, because, of course, that particular basis that Jesus gave Peter the job of leading the church, and he passed that down to the popes down through 2,000 years of history, is, of course, a key claim that backs up whatever authority the Pope may have. So it would be kind of good for us to look at that and understand just exactly what kind of authority may have passed down to the popes. And I'm not just picking on the popes. This is something we should do with every source of information about Jesus Christ. Look at the path that they took to get to us, and examine who it is that may be putting themselves in between us and Jesus Christ. Now, the proper way for somebody to do that is to get out of the way. And when you're talking to them, they should turn right around and point you to Jesus for a personal relationship directly with him. And anybody who stands up and says, well, I am the bridge between you and Jesus, you must go through me, is something that should be highly suspicious. And down through the ages, there have been many would-be prophets and other religious leaders who like to do that. And I'm not just saying within the Roman Catholic Church, but even inside of all the variations of Protestantism, which is supposedly supposed to be pointing back to the Bible as the ultimate best source that we have in terms of knowing what it is that Jesus said and did, what his apostles had to teach. But even among the Protestant pastors today, there are many who take the Bible as a starting point, but then embellish and have their own personal policy preferences and give them to you under the authority of Scripture. So certainly something we should all get in the habit of doing is looking at whoever it is that pretends to teach you, and that would be me as well. Are they pointing correctly to Jesus Christ himself? Or are they trying to get in there and take a little credit for their own personal glory and power? That's what we got to look at. So today we're going to go back and look at where the claim came from that the Pope is the rightful heir to be the leader of Jesus's church. And so with that, Connie, if we can go to the first slide, I think this is a picture by Raphael, one of the famous painters of the Renaissance. And here is his picture of a particular event that is talked about in the Bible. And of course, it's colored by what he was taught by the church leaders of his age, and therefore painted to represent their view of the storyline. But it does go back to an event where Jesus was talking to his disciples, and he asked them generally a question: who do people say that I am? And the apostles offered, several things that they'd heard people saying. And then when he got to Peter, Peter said, well, we'll look at that in a minute. But he was given great credit by Jesus for having got the right answer. And that is where we're going to pick up this particular lesson. What was that exchange, and how has it been interpreted by various religious leaders down through the ages? And so with that, let's go on to the next slide, and we'll look at something that comes from Matthew 16. And once again, after Jesus had asked, who do people say I am? This is what transpired. Simon Peter answered and said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So that was quite a powerful saying. The people that the various popes down through history evolved to a position that what he was saying to Peter was that he was a rock and they were going to build the church on top of Peter. But as you can see from my big arc of an arrow, what Jesus is saying that no, upon the rock of what you just said, when you said that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, and on this rock, this statement of who I am, I will build my church. And that's quite a difference, right? One elevates Peter, the other one elevates Christ. Which do you think is the correct answer? It's kind of interesting, by the way. I've always read that verse, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Have you ever seen gates prevail against anything? Gates are not offensive weapons. Gates are barriers put up by hell, and they're defensive measures. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against his church. The church is an offensive weapon to go against the gates of hell, break them down, and rescue people that would otherwise be consigned there forever. And that's quite an interesting little side note right there. But right now, we got to ask the question, which was it that Jesus meant? Was he elevating Peter and giving him the keys to the kingdom of heaven? Or the keys to the kingdom of heaven, the fundamental truth that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, who died for us, and therefore anyone who believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. Those are the keys to heaven. And yet, even to this day, St. Peter is pictured as standing at the pearly gates, deciding who gets in or out. And all of that twists on the interpretation of this particular passage. Well, let's look at what Peter did with this information. Now, if he really was elevated to be the first pope as a result of this comment of being the rock on which the church would be built, then you should see him elsewhere in the Bible running around, acting like he's in charge, and taking credit for things that are going on, and making sure that everybody knows that you got to go through Peter to get into heaven. Did that happen? Well, let's go ahead and look. Next slide, Connie, Acts 4, verses 5 to 12. This picks up a little event after Jesus had ascended into heaven, and they were out wandering around, spreading the word and doing miracles. And Peter and John had put together performed a miracle. And when what they'd done is basically taken a man who was crippled and got him so he could walk again. And of course, this was scandalous. They did it on the Sabbath. And, all the religious leaders of the time called them on the carpet at the Sanhedrin and said, explain yourselves. By what authority are you doing such acts? And this is where we pick up on the particular slide with the words of Peter. Now, keep in mind, Peter was just a harmless little fisherman who only spoke Aramaic and perhaps Hebrew, didn't speak anything else, and was quite humble in his origins. Now, if he had just been promoted to Pope before that by Jesus, then maybe he'd be a little bit puffed up. But which was he? Was he humble and timid, or was he puffed up and a great speaker, or just what happened? Let's look and see what it says happened here. Then Peter, filled with the Holy Spirit, said to them, you rulers of the people and elders of Israel, if we this day be examined of the good deed that was done to the impotent man, by what means is he made whole? Be it known to you all and all people of Israel that by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead, and by him does this man stand here before you whole. This is the stone which was set at naught of you builders, which has become the head of the corner. Neither is there salvation in any other, for there is none other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. I think you can see right now that Peter did not take any credit at all. He was bold. He was filled with the Holy Spirit, and he was willing to speak truth to power. But the truth he was speaking was that Jesus was the rock, the stone that the builders rejected. And at no point in there did he say, I, Peter, have been appointed to be the Pope. And I did this on my own authority. And I am the way you can get to heaven. No, he didn't. He said, there's no other name under heaven besides Jesus. That is the mark of a faithful apostle or teacher. If they turn and point you to Jesus and get out of the way. And here is exactly what Peter did, giving no signs whatsoever that he had any personal authority or power. It was all about Jesus. Okay, next slide. There's another little thread I want to pick up here. Okay, there's two things that are required for the Pope's claim to inherit from Jesus the right to be leaders of the church with the ability to make stuff up. Okay, one is that Jesus created the first Pope through Peter, and we see it's a little suspicious whether that really happened. The other thing is that he passed that down to, of all things, the Bishop of Rome. Peter is found hardly ever anywhere outside of Jerusalem. He was found north of Jerusalem in Antioch, Syria at one point, and up and down that coast, the west coast, the west coast of the Mediterranean, east coast, I guess, of the Mediterranean, west coast of Israel, and there up and down there is where he's found throughout the Bible. But here in the letter that Peter wrote, he sends a salutation that says, the church in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, and as does my son Mark. Mark being his assistant that wrote the book of Mark, the gospel according to Mark. Mark was an assistant most of the time to Peter, although he did have a couple episodes where he was working with Paul as well. But in this particular case here, the popes point out to say, see, he is saying that he is writing from the church in Babylon. And we all know that Babylon is a code word for Rome. Rome is Babylon the Great by some accounts. And it doesn't mean that he was over in the Mesopotamian region of Iraq, where Babylon is located along the Euphrates River. No. He wasn't really there. He was in Rome, and this was code words and proof that he was in Rome. But I'll point out to you that clear back since the days of Jeremiah and Daniel, when the Jews were in captivity in Babylon, about 700 BC or so, they were there for 70 years, and then when they were given permission to return, a lot of them didn't, because they were the grandchildren of the original people who had known Israel, and they'd grown up and started their own lives and businesses like the Jewish people were known to do. And a lot of them didn't leave. And so when Babylon fell after the invasion of the Persians, it slowly went downhill and it ceased to become a power center. But what was left behind were a whole lot of Jews. So it makes a whole lot of sense that Peter would have gone over to the real Babylon in order to spread the word to the Jewish people there. And we'll see coming up that Peter and Paul had agreed that it was Peter's job to go to the Jews and Paul's job to go to the Gentiles, the Greeks. And so we would expect, based on that agreement, it's more likely to find Peter over in Babylon than over in Rome, saying he's in Babylon using a metaphor to a code word for Rome. By the time we get the Apostle John, John did refer to Rome as Babylon, so we got to take that into account as a common metaphor, if you will. But you also have to take into account the body of the other stuff we're going to look at today. But nevertheless, based upon this thing here, that is one little piece of evidence that Peter may have been in Rome, assuming that he was referring to that in the letter that he just wrote here in First Peter. So that is the degree of evidence that we have that Peter was in Rome, which goes a long way from saying that he was actually Bishop of Rome, and he spent time there, and that he handed off his special dispensation and office from Jesus to a successor in Rome. He was a Jew. He spent his time in Jerusalem. It's hard to imagine he would give the Bishop of Rome his handoff of his power, especially since John, another one of the disciples, outlived him by 30 years and hung out in Ephesus most of the time. So you would have to believe that a living apostle, John, around for another whole generation after Peter was gone, was subservient to some successor who never knew Jesus that Peter handed off to. According to the Catholic Church, Linus, who the Bible does say was in Rome at the time, was the person that Peter picked as his successor and passed down his rank as Pope. And from there, it stayed with the bishops of Rome for all the rest of history. Let's go to the next slide, Connie, and we're looking at no Pope in Jerusalem. Okay, now I got to give you a little bit of history here. Some of you know Paul started out as a Pharisee persecuting the Christians, and he was heading to Damascus to arrest a bunch of Christians and bring them back to trial, which would have probably resulted in their execution. And on the way, he was struck down and blinded by Jesus, who appeared to him on the road to Damascus, and then told him to go into town and wait to be contacted. And at that point, several days later, while he was blinded by this experience, he was given his assignment to go out and become a servant of Jesus Christ. And so after his conversion, he got his sight back, and he describes what it was he did next. He went off into Arabia for a few years, returned to Damascus, and then went down to Jerusalem to meet the other apostles who he had never had direct contact with. He had been persecuting them prior to that. But after that little bit of preparation time, we don't know what happened during that time, but he went down to Jerusalem and met with the other leaders of the church, the apostles who were mostly still hanging out in Jerusalem at the time. And this verse here from Galatians, his letter to the people in central Turkey, was basically this. And he describes his encounter with the apostles. He says, "But from those who seem to be something, whatever they were, it makes no difference to me. God shows personal favoritism to no man. But for those who seemed to be something, added nothing to me. But on the contrary, when they saw that the gospel for the uncircumcised," that's the Greeks, the non-Jews, "had been committed to me, as the gospel for the circumcised was to Peter. For he who worked effectively in Peter for the apostleship to the circumcised also worked effectively in me towards the Gentiles. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised." Okay, now one thing you might know, where it says James, Cephas, and John, Cephas is another name for Peter. Peter is sometimes called Simon, sometimes Peter, and sometimes Cephas. So James, Cephas, and John, James, Peter, and John, tended to be the closest to the disciples. A lot of times Jesus would go off with them separately and give them a graduate degree, if you will, in stuff when he wasn't with all of his disciples. So these were three natural leaders of the apostles. And he says, they seem to be something, but whatever they were makes no difference to me. God doesn't, show favoritism. So he's basically telling us in this thing that, he went down and did not encounter a single leader. He did mention the fact that Peter was recognized as having a special mission to the Jewish people, and that it was agreed that he should go to the Gentiles. But that's just all the more reason not to expect Peter to wander off into Rome, the center of everything Gentile at that time, when he had lots to do in Jewish centers of the world, mainly around Jerusalem, Israel, and over in Babylon and other places like that. So this would lead us to believe that when he was there, shortly after his conversion, maybe 5 or 10 years after the resurrection of Jesus, that he found no pope. He certainly did not say, as you would expect him to say, if there was a pope down there, that I went down to Jerusalem and I met the pope and he gave me special dispensation to go to the Gentiles. Now, if there was a pope, he would certainly be bragging about it right here, saying, I was given the job from the pope of going to the Gentiles. Instead, he says that a group of people who seemed to be pillars agreed that I should do that by general consensus. No pope in Jerusalem during the first 10 years of what was happening down there. And keep in mind, this is something you would expect. If Jesus had done that in front of the other disciples, then they would have all been deferring to Peter at this meeting, including Paul. And if Paul hadn't given the Pope proper respect, it's unlikely that they would have extended the right hand of fellowship and agreed that they should go out and represent the Pope someplace else. This is a smoking gun that there was no Pope at the time. Okay, so if we go forward to the next slide, Connie, we're going to fast forward another 10 or 15 years to 49 AD in the Jerusalem Council. Now, in that period of time, Paul had gone home to his hometown in Tarsus, which is a little bit north of Antioch on the northern shore of the Mediterranean, about as far east as you can get. Tarsus is his hometown. He's hanging out there for 10 years. We don't really know why he didn't get busy, why he just stayed there. Maybe he was getting over his shock of the whole event or thinking about what he should be doing. Who knows? But it wasn't until Barnabas came over from Antioch, which was just around the corner and a little bit south along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. He went over there and recruited Paul to come to Antioch and work with their church. And it is at Antioch where people were first called Christians. So Paul was there for a few years, and then the Holy Spirit directed that congregation to send Paul and Barnabas on a missionary trip. And so they headed out to Cyprus and then up into Turkey and visited a lot of the internal cities there, and then came back home to Antioch. And when they get back, they found a new controversy had come up, because some Jews had come up from Jerusalem and were telling everybody that, yeah, that's great. It's important for you to believe in Jesus Christ, but you're still required to be circumcised and obey all the laws of Moses. And, Paul and Barnabas were adamant that that was not true. And so it was agreed that they would go down and talk to all the apostles in Jerusalem and, see if they couldn't reach a conclusion about who was right. And so that led to the first big council, the Jerusalem Council, where all the apostles were called together there. And basically they had a big discussion about it. The upshot of that discussion was that it was not God's will that the Gentiles had to obey Jewish laws, and that they were free to basically worship in their own way, as long as they accepted who Jesus was. So that was pretty huge, and that was a huge victory for Paul and Barnabas whenever they went back. In fact, it was so solid a conclusion that the council wrote it up in writing and sent a delegation back to Antioch to tell everybody, make sure everybody understood what their decision was. But we get this little account of how that decision was reached. And what I want you to notice in here is at no point did they ask the Pope for a ruling ex cathedra on this issue. They discussed it among themselves, reached a consensus, and then sent out a letter as a result of that group consensus. And at no point did they mention that there was a central authoritarian figure that was making this decision for all Christians. So let's read what it says here. Acts 15. The apostles and elders met to consider this question. After much discussion, Peter got up and addressed them. Brothers, you know that some time ago God made a choice among you that the Gentiles might hear from my lips the message of the gospel and believe. And the whole assembly became silent, and they listened to Barnabas and Paul telling about the signs and wonders God had done among the Gentiles through them. And when Paul and Barnabas had finished, James spoke up. Brothers, he said, listen to me. Simon has described to us how God first intervened to choose a people for his name from the Gentiles. The words of the prophets are in agreement with this. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. And then Pope Peter then ruled so ex cathedra, meaning from the chair, meaning he's infallible. Of course, I put that in bracket because it doesn't appear in the Bible. It's not there. There is no place where Peter came and made a ruling using his supreme authority received from Jesus in order to decide this question. Peter spoke at the meeting, was respected at the meeting, but so did James. And then they reached a group consensus and sent it on its way. And they even, if you read in Acts 15, show you the exact contents of the letter. And at no point in that letter did it say, Pope Peter has decided this. There's no mention of Peter in the letter. Another smoking gun. There was no Pope in Jerusalem at this time where Peter was. And so let's go on to the next slide there, Connie. And here we get to another little thing. This is in the same letter to the Galatians, where Paul is now talking about what happened when he went back to Antioch and Peter came up to Antioch. And this is an interesting data point because it's evidence that Peter did leave Jerusalem. At least he came up as far as Antioch along the same coastline of the Mediterranean to that northern city in Syria. And when Peter came up, he basically ran into this problem that because, as we saw in the previous slide, he agreed that he saw in a vision that it was okay to eat anything and to make the gospel available to Gentiles. He had received that personal revelation himself and was therefore fraternizing with Gentiles, something Jews don't do or didn't do at the time, until some of his other Jewish friends came along. And then he went back to being the standoffish Jew because he didn't want to lose their respect. And that just drove Paul nuts because it was being hypocritical. And so Paul addressed Peter in a rather severe way that you wouldn't expect him to address if Peter was appointed head of the church as pope. Then you would not expect Peter to be, or Paul to be talking to him the way this particular passage describes. So let's look what it says. Now, when supposedly Pope Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face because he was to be blamed. For before certain men came from James, he would eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. In other words, fearing the Jews that were coming up, interestingly, from James, as if James was an authority figure. And here, Peter, the supposed leader with all authority, is cringing at the thought of people, representatives from James, not approving of what he was doing in terms of interacting with the Gentiles directly. So once again, you would not think that this would happen if Peter had the unquestioned authority from Jesus to make decisions and decide what should be bound and not bound on earth and in heaven. So at this point, you may be saying, well, gee, Stan, it sounds like there was a little bit of bad blood between Peter and Paul. Maybe there was some rivalry there or something, and Paul was just resisting the Pope, and that's why we see those kind of things being said. Maybe he was a rebel. Yeah, well, he's a rebel that wrote over half or almost half of the entire New Testament, and most of the teaching and deep understanding of New Testament theology comes from the writing of Paul. So, if Paul was a renegade, then we're in trouble in terms of knowing anything that's going on, right? So Paul was accepted so much by all the churches everywhere that his writings were preserved and come down to us as half of the New Testament. But let's go ahead and see, just if we can, is there any place in the Bible where we get an idea of what Peter thought about Paul? we see here what Paul thought about Peter. So let's go to the next slide, Connie. Peter's opinion of Paul. And it's found written in Peter's second epistle. It's interesting. We're familiar with John 3:16. Well, this is 2 Peter 3:16. So it's easy to remember where to find this little statement, which I find fascinating. So here's what Peter says about Paul. Consider also that our Lord's patience brings salvation, just as our beloved brother Paul also wrote to you with the wisdom God gave him. He writes this way in all his letters, speaking in them about such matters. Some parts of his letters are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort as they do the rest of the scriptures to their own destruction. This is packed full of stuff. First off, of course, he refers to Paul as our beloved brother Paul, so it doesn't look like there's much bad blood between Peter and Paul at the time this letter was written anyway. And then he goes on and says, the wisdom that Paul was sharing in those letters came directly from God. It didn't come through Pope Peter, right? Wrote to you with the wisdom God gave him. And he goes on then to say that some parts of his letters are hard to understand, but people twist them just like they do the rest of the scriptures, which is another way of saying Paul's letters are scriptures and everything else is the rest of the scriptures. So how do we get the idea that New Testament letters written by people such as Paul were considered scripture? Well, right here, Peter is referring to what Paul wrote all his letters as scripture. So it doesn't sound like Peter is in any way of the opinion that Paul is inappropriately challenging his authority. If anything, at no point in here does Peter be so presumptuous as to say that knowledge of Jesus and God and relationship with Jesus comes through him. He admits a direct relationship that Paul has with Jesus Christ himself. So another data point for your consideration. Next slide, Connie. Of course, it's famous that popes and bishops and cardinals and priests are not allowed to get married. They're supposed to be celibate. Okay, well, that actually didn't get to be a rule until 600 AD when Pope Gregory the Great made that rule. At the time of the apostles, most of them were married. Peter was married, and certainly not looking like he was subject to any special rules for popes or priests. Matthew, it says, when Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. So just think about that. Not only was Peter crucified upside down, but he had a mother-in-law. How much worse could it be? Of course, the whole story about Peter being crucified upside down in Rome is another piece of uncorroborated legend that has been passed down and accepted as fact, but is nowhere mentioned in the Bible at all. And in 1 Corinthians, Paul is talking about his right to have certain privileges, including the right to be married. And he says, have we no right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Okay, so most of them had wives going along with them on these trips. And so the whole idea that came down that priests and so on have to be celibate is one of many inventions that were made by later popes, in this case 600 years later. But we see it emerging here as a clear contradiction to the behavior of Peter and the other apostles. Okay, next slide. Now, I'm not going to read all of these things to you. I just want you to sort of glance over my shoulder at this list, but you can go into the book of Romans and see what Paul said when he was writing a letter to the Romans from somewhere else in the empire. And as you can see, he's saying, greet Priscilla and Aquila and greet this and greet that. And he goes down through this exhaustive list of different people who he knows to be living in Rome, and finishes up with greet one another, even with a holy kiss. And then conspicuously missing from these greetings is, oh yes, and greet Pope Peter, our Holy Father and the Vicar of Christ. Of course, popes down through the history have added more and more titles to themselves to glorify their position. Peter never used such titles. And Paul, in this letter, would surely have been expected, if he was writing a letter to the Romans, to have acknowledged the Pope, if the Pope had been living there. And, that's something that if you read all the different things that Paul did, he was a very well-educated person, and he spoke 4 different languages, and he spoke to King Agrippa and to Felix and Festus. And if you go look at how he addressed them, he was very careful to use their proper titles. Proconsul Gallio is another one. So wherever he went, he was always careful to follow protocol. But there's no protocol here whatsoever acknowledging the Jesus Christ appointed Peter as he being present in Rome at the time he wrote the letter to the Romans, offering to come there and teach them the gospel. Why in the world would he need to go to Rome and teach them the gospel if Peter was already there as the bishop? Very presumptuous, don't you think? But as you can see here, no evidence whatsoever that Peter had a role in Rome, or we would expect to find Paul acknowledging it. Next slide. Now, later on, Paul, in around 67 AD, the year he died, being beheaded, probably by Nero, he wrote a letter to Timothy. Now, Timothy was, somebody who'd been with him in the missionary trips since the second missionary trip and had gone along with him. And he had raised Timothy up to be a pastor. And in fact, the letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy, are instructions to Timothy on how to go about being a pastor. So he is there talking to Timothy, writing from a prison in Rome. And a couple things that you would expect about all this is, once again, if he's writing from Rome, you'd think he'd mention something about Peter, right? Now, it's possible that Peter was executed that same year. That's what the legend is. In which case, you would think he would mention the fact that Peter was in prison, or that Peter had been crucified, or if Peter was still at large, that Peter was visiting him, looking after him, and had a message for him to share. But as you can see, he goes down mentioning all these names in yellow. He says, only Luke is with me, and accounts for where many of the other people that had worked with him in the past had gone off to, some abandoning him, some following his instructions to go to do a duty somewhere. But when you get clear down to the end, on the very last sentence, you'll notice that it says, and so do Prudence, Linus, and Claudia. Linus is the one that the popes say was the second pope who took over from Peter, and Linus is there in Rome, but no mention of Peter. You would think, if he is setting up a set of rules for pastors and writing it off to Timothy, that he would mention something like, Pope Peter approved this message and sends his blessings, right? If you're doing something as important as writing instructions on how to be a pastor, and you've got the Pope right there, you would expect to find him mentioned. And yet, nothing. The Bible is completely silent on Peter's whereabouts. And that's not what you would expect under these circumstances. So we move on to the next slide. And I'd just sort of like to show you the real political context of this time. And you can go back and see the letters that were being written back and forth among the different leading cities during the period of time, let's say the first 600 years of Christianity. And it turned out that there were quickly 6 different bishops, one in Rome, one in Constantinople, in Ephesus, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, Egypt. The yellow dots you see on the picture there. And so these bishops were in constant communication, talking back and forth. And one of the main discussions is who had the authority to speak for them. And it was usually an argument between the Bishop of Rome, claiming that privilege, arguing that the other bishops out there should not make any decisions without checking with him. If it was well known during those years that Peter, first, had been given the job of Pope, and second, had somehow let it get from Jerusalem over to Rome, a very unlikely decision since he spent most of his time in Jerusalem, then you would think that that would be generally well known and everybody would accept it and there'd be no argument. But all the letters that are out there, it was a continuous battle over how much authority the Bishop of Rome should have. It wasn't until about 450 AD when Pope Leo the Great was the first person to actually be called Pope. And prior to that, there were instances of bishops being referred to as Pope, but there was no single Pope anywhere until until Leo the Great. And it wasn't until Gregory the Great in about 600 AD that the modern day concept of a Pope having ruling power over top of kings, the right to crown kings and so on, was established. So for 600 years, that's like 3 times longer than the United States has been in existence, the popes of Rome were struggling to establish their authority and finally succeeded in doing it, but it was still an ongoing battle of claiming more power. It wasn't until 800 AD when on Christmas, Charlemagne, a French king, came down and visited Rome. And while he was kneeling at the altar in one of the cathedrals there, the Pope at that time walked up to him and placed a crown on his head and proclaimed that Charlemagne was now emperor and in charge of the entire, inheriting the entire Roman Empire. And of course, Charlemagne was not expecting that, and maybe didn't even want it, but given the fact that the Pope had just crowned him emperor, he's not going to take it back, right? So he assumed the office of emperor, but the thing the Pope got out of it was the precedent that he can now crown emperors, which elevated the office of the Point over all the other kings that were in the known world. Quite a nice political accomplishment. Those were the kind of political stunts that were going on as the Bishop of Rome worked to grow his power to the point where everybody would accept that he was leader of the church unquestioned. And it did not come down from Peter. It was something that was won politically over centuries of efforts and intrigue. And if you go and read all of that, you'll understand that this was human claimed and seized power politically over the ages, and not something that was delegated by Jesus to Peter and somehow handed off clear across the Mediterranean to Rome, which had been persecuting the Christians for the first 300 years until Constantine came along and made the Roman Empire Christian. Okay, so it doesn't seem very likely that Peter would hand off leadership of Christianity to the center of the Roman Empire that was persecuting Christianity. And yet that is what's claimed, and that is from whence the popes have derived their claim to power. And if you eliminate the idea that Christ didn't give Peter such powers and that Peter didn't pass them on to Rome, you've got no reason at all for the popes to have any special power or ability to override the Bible with their own personal policy preferences, which is, of course, what led to the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, when people started saying, hey, wait a minute. And of course, Martin Luther tacked 95 Theses up onto a church door, which outlined all the things that the popes were saying that couldn't be found in the Bible. And one of the things, of course, challenged was the whole idea that the popes got their authority from Jesus Christ in the first place. So, wow, is that shocking for some of you? Maybe so. I'm just telling you the history of where this comes from. The problem is most of us sit here 2,000 years later, and the Kool-Aid has been processed so much down through the ages that we just accept it as fact. And anytime someone wants to go talk to the leader of Christianity, by default, they go talk to the Pope because they don't know any better. Let's go forward one more slide, Connie. So how is it then that the popes, in the total absence of such an office being created by Christ and passed down to them specifically, as Bishop of Rome. How in the world did they pull this off? How did they get to be the point where they could crown emperors and to where they ruled the world, and in fact were in charge of dividing up who got what chunks of the New World? Popes got to decide, who got Brazil and who got Argentina, and so on. Well, they were at peak power at that time, and so I've put some bullets down here as sort of a way to wrap up an explanation of how did the popes get their power. Certainly that story that Peter was pope and in Rome and decided that his successor should be the Roman bishop, that's a pretty nice story. And if you can couple that with the fact that the geographic position of Rome, people were used to, for centuries, deferring to Rome as the center of the empire. So whoever's in Rome automatically got, a little extra prestige, just like you might imagine an organization that has offices in Washington, D.C. and other places, that the Washington, D.C. office might be perceived as the most prestigious office to belong to. Certainly Constantine and Constantinople were significant. Constantine converted the empire to Christianity in 300 AD and then moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople. Today it's Istanbul. But at the time he moved over there, there was a shift in a power vacuum left in Italy. And the Bishop of Rome took advantage of that and started taking care of political matters inside the area of Italy. And that gave him a power base from which he could continue to exercise that power. And of course, there were a lot of talented bishops of Rome, politically talented, people who knew how to maneuver in order to capture power. And the history of those popes down through 1500, 1800 years is one of consolidating power and maneuvering politically in order to increase their power in interacting with kings and picking who was going to be king, gave them considerable power. A really important power that they had was the ability to excommunicate entire countries, okay? So if a particular king displeased them, they would excommunicate his country, which would cause a rebellion and cause the king to cave in. Huge, powerful tool to get the various kings to acknowledge the Pope's special powers. During the time, there were doctrinal controversies, a whole bunch of things they argued about, and had councils like the Jerusalem Council and the Nicene Council and many other meetings where bishops all got together and argued and decided different issues, which of course appears to be how God intended it to happen, just like the Jerusalem Council involved all the leaders and elders getting together to reach a consensus on an issue that was scriptural based. But what the popes did, they seldom attended these conferences, but when they were over, they would do a decree that said that the Pope has decided whatever the council had decided, and therefore they picked the most politically expedient decision to be their decision and took credit for it as having the authority to do so, and spread that wide that it was the Pope that decided, when in fact they read the tea leaves from the councils and then took credit for those decisions. Certainly the unavailability of scriptures played a role. Unlike today, very few people had access to what the Bible said. So whatever the popes said was the rules, were the rules, and there was no scriptures to contradict them available to the average person. And so it was, in fact, for most of the Dark Ages, it was illegal for non-priests to have access to the scriptures. And that was certainly convenient, wasn't it, for being able to make up the rules any way they wanted to consolidate their own power. And it wasn't until Martin Luther and a few others started translating the Bible into German and English and so on, that they started to say, hey, wait a minute, the Bible says this isn't what the popes are telling us. And that's what led to the 95 Theses that Martin Luther pinned up. A lot of them were complaining about the idea of indulgences, that the popes had a vast treasury of merit that they could use to get people out of purgatory, which is itself an invented place, and that if you wanted to get a loved one out of purgatory, you could make a donation to the church, and the Pope would reach into his vast treasury of merit and spend some of his good works to get your loved one out of purgatory. But of course, there is no one who is without sin. No, not no one. There is no treasury of merit. The saints and the popes were not sinless, and in some cases, some of the worst people ever to exist. And they did not have anything other than the blood of Christ the rest of us have to atone for sins. Yet they were selling their supposed excess good works to other people to get them out of time spent in purgatory. Pretty grim results, but that led to the Protestant Reformation, the production of the King James Bible, and trying to get down to the bottom of what did the Bible say, and challenging whether or not the popes had the authority to modify what the Bible said. Another thing that happened during that time was Germanic invasions. The Huns and the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and so on were coming down from up in the France and Germany and Switzerland area, and taking turns conquering Italy, but being very clever and diplomatic, particularly Pope Leo the Great, back around the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. All these barbarians came in from the north and were in awe of the Roman architecture and the rich artifacts that they saw. And so it didn't take very long for the Pope to convince them that they needed to have their kings report to the Pope. He allowed them to have physical power, but they had to acknowledge that he was spiritually superior to them. And so he took over the people that invaded, and now they became his army to enforce his power as he continued to grow and play one king off against another politically in order to stay on top of the pile, so to speak. The rise of monasteries throughout that area pointed back, because all those monasteries gave acknowledgement to Rome as being the head of things. And so wherever they went, they were little seeds of pointing every people back to Rome. Political alliances with different German kings, for example, like the Constantine and his father Pippin the Short and his father Charles the Hammer Martel. All of those guys were heavily involved in struggling to use the popes to get them extra credibility so that they could hold on to their thrones. And the Pope was using that decision as to which kings he would support and which kings he wouldn't support. And he'd play the political thing of waiting to see which side won, and then claim he was on the side of the side that won, and therefore ensuring that always they stayed on top. Certainly Gregory the Great in 600 AD was the first real pope that had all that power, and he was very good at shoring up that power. And then finally, if you just look at that chart, all that red out there is where Islam has controlled at one time or another. And the thing you can see that Rome was the only city out of all those bishops that didn't get overrun by Islam. So Muslims wiped out all other possible leading bishops from taking on the job, and did not ever take control of Italy. And so the Pope remained unscathed by all those conquests. So there you have it. That's why the popes stand in this unique position. I guess I should mention just one other little end to this. At about 1798, when Napoleon was out doing his conquests, he went down and conquered Italy and captured the Pope and hauled him off into exile, and he died in France somewhere. And basically, Napoleon decapitated the papal system Now, there were still people who got that title, but they didn't have the power before, after Napoleon, until Mussolini, around World War II, finally gave the Vatican its own land and made it its own independent area, and did that in order to win political support for Mussolini's own goals. And it's only since then that there's been a resurgence of flamboyant, powerful-looking popes, although they don't typically have the power they used to have of deciding who's going to be kings and so on. But the status of the pope that we all know in our lifetime is not the status of a pope throughout history. It's been a long and intricate political battle of typical infighting to achieve power the good old-fashioned way, by political intrigue. And so if you go study your history, then you can get an idea. And, why would I bring all of this up? Well, I would like people, when they are deciding what they're going to believe, to understand why they believe it. And I've, in other lessons, talked about why the Bible is the best, most accurate information we have about what Jesus said and did, coming from eyewitness accounts that were proliferated everywhere and brought forward in time, with 5,600 different manuscripts out there, all of which agree with each other, even though they were spread out in time and lost and found. Nobody came along and corrupted them in a massive way, or we would have many different copies to disagree about. And there are very few disagreements among all those manuscripts. So that gives us a good understanding of what we can rely on as eyewitness accounts of what Jesus said and did. And anybody that contradicts that had better have pretty good reason. And up until this point, the popes have said, well, we get to contradict it because we have inherited the ability to bind and unbind things on earth and heaven from something that was given to Peter and passed down to us. And therefore, we don't have to listen to the Bible. We can change it if we want to. And as you can see from today, I'm challenging that claim. And here are some of the things that basically came up out of that. This is a history of events that have happened as a consequence of the popes coming up with this argument that they received those special privileges handed down to them through Christ, from Christ through Peter to them. And so obviously this little chart is going to be hard to read up over my shoulder here, but you can freeze frame and zoom in on it. But I'll just tell you this series of events that happened in history that made the Pope what he is today, and shows you when some things that you would have thought go back to the authority of Christ were made up as recently as 1950. So let's just go through them real quick and we're done. Okay, so back in around 313, the Edict of Milan legalized Christianity, and by 320, Constantine had ruled that all must accept the Christian creed. Then he moved to Constantinople in 330 and freed the Pope up to be on his own. The Pope first asserted as St. Peter's successor not until 410. So for twice the period of time the United States has been in existence, there was no claim that Peter had passed anything down to the Pope of Rome. That was a claim that came in much later. Then, if we look at the year 538 is when the popes declared head over all churches. It took that long. Wow. First real pope was in 600. That was Gregory the Great. And then there was this thing called the Donation of Constantine that was forged in 754, a document that was supposed to have gone back to Constantine, saying that when he left Rome, he handed the keys to the empire to the Pope. And it turned out that much later in history, hundreds of years later, that was used to establish the Pope's authority over certain pieces of land and certain kings. And it turns out that that was a forgery, and it's admitted to be a forgery, but no one ever took back the power given to the popes from using that particular forgery that was made back in the 500s. The Pope's power to crown kings was established with Charlemagne on Christmas Eve 800, and the popes then started launching crusades throughout the 1100s and 1200s. They would decree when kings were obligated to send armies to form crusaders that would go off and do whatever the Pope wanted to see done. By the year 1302, every human creature was subject to the Pope. That was the ruling the popes had made at that time, and since they were the heirs appointed by Christ, they were the guys who could make such audacious claims. It got bigger and bigger as it went along. Popes' decisions were the same as God's in 1490. So 2 years before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, the popes were announcing that their decisions were the same as God's. And by 1510, just about the start of the Protestant Revolution, the popes were declaring that the Pope is another god on earth. Okay, keep promoting it. Does that sound familiar? I mean, down through the ages, how many rulers have named themselves gods in order to get people to comply with them? And of course, in 1798, Napoleon overthrows the Pope. And then in 1870 is when the popes decreed that they were infallible when ruling ex cathedra, from the chair. In other words, when they were saying, I declare as part of my office in this chair of St. Peter that such and such a policy is true, I cannot be wrong. And of course, then all the other popes after that can never change that, right? Because then he would be wrong, would undermine their own power. So it's a one-way kind of a decision. And then in 1950, the Pope ruled ex cathedra that Mary was assumed, that she did not die. She went into heaven like Jesus went into heaven. And a few other people like Elijah went up in a whirlwind, and certain other instances. The Pope decided that Mary, being Virgin Mother and Mother of God and Queen of Heaven and all these other titles that they've given her, she couldn't possibly have died, so she was assumed. And that doctrine is less than 100 years old. Okay, it was a ruling made 4 years before I was born. This gives you an idea of how the popes evolved by building little bit by little bit by little bit on things that increased their authority and maneuvering in order to grow that authority. And the thing that allows those popes to wander around wearing their fancy outfits and waving at the masses is all a legend that they have created. And it's always very dangerous when humans create a throne for a man to sit on, right? Humans are corruptible. And so by building this throne of the Pope, it is now sitting there as an opportunity for an evil person, I mean really evil, not the typical human evil or the things we've seen through many, many, many popes, if you read their histories. That is a seat that Satan can take. And he can sit in the temple of God, declaring himself to be God, which is one of the prophecies of Daniel. Okay, the Antichrist, when he arrives, sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Well, gee, that sounds like, the Pope is another god on earth, something that came out in 1510. Sounds like it's building in that general direction, right? It's not a good idea to elevate a human office up that high, because the ultimate use of such an office is to rule the world in place of Christ. And in fact, that's one of the titles of the Pope, Vicar of Christ, substitute for Christ on earth. So this right here is the end of my set. It's probably going to upset people because it's telling them things different than they may have been taught. I don't want to create a feud among my Christian brothers. But on the other hand, I gotta tell you where this stuff comes from. Most of us don't know these kind of things, and therefore can be taught anything and led astray. So what is my main walk away from this? Anytime somebody elevates themselves and puts themselves on a pedestal in between you and Jesus Christ, you should be suspicious, and you should go and ask, where is the scriptural authority for that person to do so? And down through the ages, many, many people have tried to do that. They've tried to say, you've got to come through me. Remember what happened to even Moses, right? Moses was told to go strike or speak to the rock, and the rock would gush forth water for the Israelites when they were lost in the wilderness. And Moses did not listen to those instructions. He went up and said, "Must we do everything for you?" and struck the rock with his own rod, making it look like it was his authority and his actions that was causing this miracle to occur for the Israelites. And as a result, God was very displeased with Moses and said, "Guess what? You're not going into the promised land anymore. I'll let you look over and see it, but you're going to die, and someone else will lead the people into the promised land because you were presumptuous in taking my glory for yourself." Okay? Watch out anytime someone takes glory for themselves. I was in Iraq and listening to a preacher from Africa talking to his people, also stationed there from Uganda, and he gave an incredible 2-hour no-notes sermon that everybody sat there just with their jaw dropped. It was such a good sermon. And when it was over, I walked up to him and thanked him for inviting me to his service and told him it was a wonderful job. I've never seen anything like it. And his response to me was, "To God be the glory." That is the way a Christian leader is supposed to act. A Christian leader is never supposed to go after glory themselves. And when they do, you can't trust them. So there, that's my rant for the day. Packed full of information that I hope you'll take seriously when you're deciding who it is you're going to trust with your eternal salvation. Make sure that whoever's guiding you spiritually is pointing to Jesus and not getting in the middle and taking some of that power and glory for themselves. Okay, Connie, I'm ready for whatever questions may have come in. And if you haven't put your questions in, please type them in caps so that Connie can spot them. And we got a list of stuff here, a lot. And okay, so here's one. Adriana Brown says, Peter's remains were found under the altar in the Vatican. Yeah, that was a few years after Peter's remains in a box called Simon Bar-Jonah were found in Jerusalem. And then because of that archaeological find, the Vatican in secret went around and dug up a bunch of stuff and came up with something that they said were Peter's bones. Okay, got to be very careful at the source of this kind of information and look back and see, why were those bones not found up until they were found someplace else, and then the Vatican needed an answer to that question. Suddenly they went and dug them up. And then Stan, is Peter or Paul your favorite? Man, I shouldn't have favorites, but Paul's my favorite. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I like Peter, and I think he's an amazing dude. And I particularly like the fact that when the time came to give glory to God, he got out of the way and pointed to God. There is salvation in nobody else, for there is no other name under heaven given to men by which you can be saved. He didn't put himself in the middle of all this stuff and say, I am the person you need to come through. Nobody comes to the Father but the Pope. And I could substitute a bunch of other religions you can think of where the leaders have said that. I'm not out here to start a big war with all the other factions, because I can even point to many mainstream Protestant denominations that have started to teach things as if they were biblical, banning things like drinking alcohol when Christ turned water into wine, and the communion cup was wine. Okay, but yet put into their teachings are you can't use these different substances, and that is put in there with the same level of authority as words of Christ and the apostles. Now, it's probably good policy not to abuse alcohol, but I'm saying mixing it in with the truth from Christ and putting your own preferences and teaching it as one package is a recipe for disaster, and you find it in most churches. And let me say that there are saved Christians who trust in Jesus in all those churches, including the Catholic Church as well, and many other places that are faithful and trusting in Jesus. So it's not a question of you have to be in one particular denomination or you're wrong. I'll go out on a limb and say every denomination is probably wrong about something. You are responsible for understanding what the truth is and checking like a good Berean in Acts 17 to see whether things you're being taught are so. Show it to me in the scriptures, or it didn't happen, is the watchword as far as I'm concerned. Let's see. And I guess the question is, why is Paul my favorite? Well, we know most about what he did because of the book of Acts. We do have in the book of Acts some things Peter did, but we know much more about Paul. And Paul was just, this Energizer bunny that took a licking and kept on ticking. And I just love the things he writes and how he expresses it and everything. So I got to give Paul by a wide margin my favorite in terms of that. Not that that matters. Every one of them is an inspired servant of Jesus Christ, and we should listen to them. Okay, comment. This is more of a history lesson. Do you like today's Pope? I don't want to get into individual personalities, okay? Every Pope who has failed to acknowledge the fact that prior popes have made stuff up that's not in the Bible becomes complicit in all those errors that have compounded over the centuries, okay? And of course, certain popes in the past period of time have been very conservative. This one seems to be very liberal and is messing around in politics, as most popes have done. So what you see in this pope is what you've seen through the ages. Okay. The Vatican spoke of aliens years back. What are your thoughts on that? Will you do a show on that? Well, we might. I actually did talk a little bit of that on Coast to Coast with Connie Willis on Christmas Eve, where we talked about the fact that the Star of Bethlehem was undoubtedly a UFO. And since you brought it up, I'll just mention, how can the Star of Bethlehem be a UFO? Well, it was unidentified. It was an object, and it had to be flying because if you're outside the Earth's atmosphere, you can't come to hover over a particular stable. I challenge you to have a helicopter take off from a stable roof and fly up 100 feet, and for you to figure out what it's hovering over. And if it goes up 1,000 feet, there's no chance. Maybe you'll figure out what city it's over. And if it's out of the atmosphere and the Earth is rotating underneath it, and it's not going to hover over top of anything. So whatever the Star of Bethlehem was, it was an atmospheric phenomenon, a unidentified flying object, but probably spiritual in nature, which begs the question, are UFOs themselves spiritual in nature? Are they, as some authors have suggested, demons impersonating UFOs, because modern man is more likely to accept the rule of aliens than they are to accept the rule of demons. So why not impersonate aliens in order to take over the world? So yeah, UFOs are probably out there and probably demonic in origin. At least that's my theory. I have no idea. Okay, let's see what else we got here. Why all these wars? Why all this fighting? Is this the fault of Adam and Eve? Well, in some sense, but when Adam, listened to Eve and disobeyed God, the whole earth, all of creation fell, and man became a permanently sinful creature. And all these things that have happened down through the ages have been demonstrating that humans in that state, separated from God, are incorrigible and are going to do all these things that we see about right now. And the reason for these wars, which Jesus said would happen, there would be wars and rumors of wars going down through all the ages, but that was not a sign of his second coming. That was a natural state of man, the sinful nature of man, the wanting to be selfish and claim that which belongs to someone else. Or another way of looking at it, we're no better than the animals. Animals, it's perfectly okay to prey and take the life of some other animal. And humans are in that status now. When we get to the renewed status, then when the lion lies down with the lamb and when everything becomes peaceful again, in Jesus is ruling the nations, then things will get back to the kind of world that we would like, but not until we're willing to acknowledge God's rule. And as long as humans want to rule, we're going to have God say, all right, you guys want to be in charge, but you know what's going to happen. And we get all those bad things happening because of that. Mike Crow says popes were treated like feudal kings. Well, yeah, they wanted to be, and they wanted more than that. They wanted to use their power to take control and rule kings. And in fact, the hat that the popes wear has 3 crowns, indicating that they are rulers of things in heaven, things on earth, and things below the earth. That little crown shows that they claim the right to rule kings. And what do you think of popes? Did you have a favorite? Well, if I had to pick a pope, it'd probably be Gregory the Great. He was really an amazing guy. He advanced the goals of that, but in general, he was a retired monk that got drafted the job. He didn't seek it like so many other popes sought power for the sake of power. Once he got it, he did what other popes did, which was consolidate power and rule and make up new rules during his tenure that furthered the cause. So, yeah, he's a pretty good choice, but if you go look at him, some of them were absolutely despicable in every possible way. Look up the Cadaver Synod. Just Google that, the Cadaver Synod, and you'll hear the story of one pope digging up his predecessors out of the grave and putting him on trial, and then cutting off the fingers that he used to bless and throwing them in the river. And the previous pope's supporters got that body out and buried it again, only to have another pope several popes later go dig up that body again and throw it back in the river. The number of dirty, sneaky tricks that were done, it's just very unseemly for anybody of apostolic authority. And I've studied them down through every century, and the same tendencies are shown everywhere. So go get yourself a good history book of what the popes did through history, and you'll see that they were just people seeking power. And then Sue says, wondering what Stan thinks about the non-canonical books. Well, I guess I'll give the standard answer to that. What was done to make something canonical in the Council of Nicaea was to try to see what evidence do we have that each of these texts is traceable back to an apostle or somebody who worked closely with an apostle. The 2 people who worked closely with apostles were Mark and Luke, working with Peter and Paul. The rest of the writings were done by apostles, and those were the ones that said, these are inspired. Now, we don't know if other things might be inspired or not. There's some other documents out there that tell a parallel account and are endorsed even in the Bible. I think the Gospel of Thomas is mentioned by Jude or James or somebody for something. So those are called biblically endorsed non-canonical parallel texts. And so when you read them, you say, well, okay, I know where they came from. We don't have a good evidence that these are inspired, and therefore they're not the gospel truth. But on the other hand, to the extent they don't contradict the Gospels, we might learn more interesting things. And in particular, several of them are very interesting in terms of talking about giants in the Old Testament. As mentioned in the book Genesis chapter 6, just before the flood, we hear there were giants in those days. And they were hybrids of demons and humans. And that's pretty shocking stuff to find sitting in the Bible, and it's confirmed in those other texts with more details about how that happened. So I accept that those other biblically endorsed parallel texts are useful, but you should never take anything they say that contradicts one of the other texts. If that happens, go with the ones that are traceable back to an apostle. Okay, stuff's coming in here fast. Murray says, have you heard of Heligoland? One of Hitler's first acts was to claim it from Austrian Museum. Charlemagne first told her, the Spear of Destiny. That's pretty cool, but no, I haven't heard about that at all. There's many things I don't know, but I find that to be fascinating. Particularly, I find the whole stories of Charles the Hammer, who basically in the Battle of Tours, just outside of Paris, stopped the Muslim invasion of Europe. And if he hadn't done that, Europe would have been Islamic, and Christianity would have been snuffed out that was the grandfather of Charlemagne. So I find that particular part of history to be particularly interesting. Getting funky, who are or have been your favorite Bible teachers? Would that, what we call aliens, be fallen angels? Yes. And would they be part of the final great deception? Yes. And in fact, that's a good reference. It says when we're talking about the end times that he sends upon them a great deception, that they should believe the lie. We don't know what that might be, but certainly a great deception is to have the Vulcans show up and say, hey, you've been elected now that you've reached this stage of development to become members of the United Federation of Planets. And please elect a representative and submit yourself to rule by that. And in fact, they're not Vulcans at all. They're demons impersonating Vulcans. And everybody in this world, prepared by all the sci-fi out there, would say, wow, that's great. We've been elected to the Federation. We've grown up as a people, and now we're part of the galactic civilization. Wouldn't that be a great way to conquer the world without firing a shot? So yeah, that could well be it. Who knows if that's what happens. But, it would be a good idea to be suspicious of all great deceptions, including the deception that Peter was the first pope. Okay, let's see. Favorite Bible teachers. Oh, man. Well, I've had quite a few that I've paid attention to years, and I would have to say Lon Solomon. He's a pastor up at McLean Bible Church in Northern Virginia. Has amazed me with his teachings and recordings, and I've listened to hundreds of his sermons and learned an awful lot from him. So there's a guy, and there's other guys out there that I've benefited from a lot. If I start going and naming names, I'll probably leave somebody out. So maybe I won't go down specifically, but that would be a good thing for me to put up there as to who are the great sources. Certainly, I love some of the great preachers of the time, like Jonathan Edwards and Charles Spurgeon, and even John Wesley. So a lot of those guys that founded various branches of Protestantism. Wesley for himself has 52 standard sermons that I've read, and he of course wrote in the language of his time, which you have to concentrate a little bit more to understand. But it's just full of really good, solid thinking. So, there'd be those type of guys. But certainly C.S. Lewis is somebody that has written a lot of good stuff. Now, I'm not claiming any of these guys are infallible, and you should look at everything they taught. And that some things they taught might not be right. But you should be a good Berean, Acts chapter 17, and go to the scriptures and check whether any of these guys, what they're saying is so. Okay. And then there's a Stan I like, sharing his smartness, sharing his opinion maybe. Dallas says, led astray and will be led astray if they do not open their eyes to a mere man elevating his position, taking glory. Yeah, man. The easy test is, does any leader take any glory for themselves? If they're taking glory for themselves, run. And let's see. Hessensack says, religion is a Roman psyop. Jesus was sedated and knocked out with Byzantine. He then woke up and rose from the dead, or not so. He was recorded to be in Britain as a lame. Well, you're going to have to do a lot better than make statements like that. You're going to have to go back and show where the evidence of this is. Jesus was executed by professional Roman soldiers who did that as a daily job. And they knew exactly how to execute somebody and how to know when they were dead. And they ran a spear through his heart to make sure he was dead when he appeared to be. And if they ever let any prisoner escape, they would be executed. So you could be darn sure no Roman executioner is going to let somebody get away and not be done. So you've just been fed a whole bunch of garbage. Okay. So that's all I've got right now. Is there anything more out there coming, Connie, or do we get it all caught up? Oh, she's busy scouring, looking for anything. Well, thank you. I apologize for anybody that I may have offended. I never hold back on saying what appears to be biblical truth in order to avoid offending somebody. I hope you won't be offended if I have challenged some of the things you've been taught. I hope you use it as a way of saying, whoa, wait a minute. I got to stop listening to humans, including Stan. And I got to start digging in the Bible and finding out what the truth is. And it doesn't hurt to consult multiple other teachers, and they can help you find the verses in the Bible that you ought to be aware of. That's all great. But ultimately, trust no one other than those scriptures, which have come down to us from many, many channels. And contrary to what people would like to claim about them being corrupted, once those scriptures are spread out into all kinds of little hidey holes for several centuries when the church was being persecuted, and to have one of them would be the same as getting executed. So these were hidden many places, and yet as we find them all and bring them forward, they all say the same thing, giving a lie to the claim that they were copies of copies of copies that kept getting changed over and over again, or that somebody made up a big lie and spread it everywhere, and it's been corrupted. My question is, how did they all get corrupted in exactly the same way? There's no GitHub out there where you can go and make an edit and then delete all other copies. They were out there in independent form, 5,600 texts and fragments that all tell us what was being said and passed forward from us. So that's a pretty good, solid place to go and understand what was really being taught back then. The other neat thing about it is, if you look at all the writings of the church leaders, all the sermons they wrote, and everything they wrote, all that stuff that's been found, they quoted the Bible enough that you could probably reconstruct most of the Bible from their writings, and they say the same thing. So we've got a very good probability that we know what was being taught. And if somebody is making something else up, then you've got to really go research it yourself. And let's see. Another question. Can you explain dispensationalism? Well, I'd be happy to. And, that's worthy of an entire lesson. But to give you a short answer, that is the understanding that God dealt with man in different dispensations. That, he started out early on in the age of innocence, where, basically the Garden of Eden. And then it was the age of conscience when everybody did what they thought was right in their own eyes. And then there was the age of the patriarchs, where the leaders and government of men was based on heads of families like Abraham and so on. And then it came on down, and there was an age of what was called the law, the age of Moses, that 1,500 years during which God gave specific rules of how we were to behave. And then the age of grace, which is since Jesus, and then eventually the millennial kingdom, where Jesus will be the government instead of man. And all of those are showing all kinds of different ways God revealed different things and taught different things and revealed certain things and dealt with men in certain ways. And in every case, each one of those dispensations, men have failed. And all of this is to prove that we need to accept God as our king again. And that's the point of history, is to show we can't do it ourselves. And let's see. Murray says the Higgle lance was purported the spear that was used to pierce the heart of Christ. Okay. That is something I'm skeptical of. Okay. Because at the time that lance was used, it was just an ordinary lance, an ordinary spear, and Jesus was nothing of any significance to those Romans. And so nobody venerated, that owned those lances, venerated Christ in any way that would make them hold on and mark that particular lance as being special. That sounds to me very much like something that was started back in the days of Constantine, when his mother was given the assignment of going and finding Christian artifacts everywhere. And so everywhere, anything, whether it was Peter's big toe or whatever, all these artifacts that were brought along, and people were taught to revere or even worship or to have magical powers, all very suspicious. And and probably things that were made up in order, to make the owner have some degree of specialness. Now, there were artifacts with magical powers, evidence that certain people were healed in the presence of some of the apostles when encountering a handkerchief or falling into their shadow or something like that. So, not saying that there might not be a case. A good example of that would be the woman who had been suffering from decades of bleeding, and she worked her way through the crowds and reached out and managed to touch Jesus's robe and was healed. It wasn't Jesus's robe that healed her, it was her faith. And Jesus immediately detected it and said, "Go, your faith has healed you." It wasn't touching the artifact. So anybody that notices anything like that from touching some of those artifacts down through the ages probably was healed because of their faith and not because of something special about the artifact. So it's just really hard to imagine any artifacts associated with, like, the nails that were used to crucify him. There was nobody there at the time. The apostles scattered, okay? They were in hiding. There was nobody around to gather up these things and say, wow, these will be great souvenirs someday. Jesus was just another criminal as far as the Roman soldiers were concerned, and probably did not save those things at the time. Let's see what else we got. Dwayne, cat's hungry, crypto monkey. The truth is out there, Scully. The scriptures will be offensive to many. Well, yes, this is actually true. Something called the offense of the cross is basically the fact that the cross is out there saying God had to come down and die for us because you couldn't save yourself. And that's offensive to many people who want to be in charge of their own lives. And that is the single most grave sin, wanting to sit on God's throne, not willing to admit that he's in charge, that we can't do it ourselves. And so a lot of people are going to find that offensive. And, in some sense, that's another sign of reality, because who would make up something so offensive, right? Most of the time, most religions are out there telling people what they want to hear. And when you find something like this coming down, it has a ring of authenticity to it because it's so not what people expect. Okay, so I guess at this point, that's all we got. I'd like to point out that there are 2 Twitters and 3 Facebook pages and DLive, places where you can find this stuff or refer people to. So we got lots of Blue Rock Talk platforms, and Connie's busy looking for more. She'll probably have an announcement of another such platform as early as Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken. And so, we're going to try to get this stuff all out there where we can reach as many people as possible. But once again, don't want any glory, just want to get the word out and point everybody to the scriptures and to God itself. So until next time, I'll say, have a good week. Talk to you later.